There is a strange moment that happens when an old VHS tape stops being a piece of rubbish and becomes an object of interest. It usually does not happen because the film is famous. Sometimes it is not even because the tape is particularly old. The difference can be something much smaller: a logo, an early release, a missing certificate, an unusual label, or a factory seal that has survived untouched for decades. Most VHS tapes are still worth very little. That is important to understand before we go any further. Millions were produced, and ordinary opened copies of popular films are generally common. The interesting part is what happens when an ordinary-looking cassette has one detail that separates it from the millions around it. That is where collectors begin to pay attention. And some of the most interesting examples are sitting in exactly the places where nobody thinks to look. Old cupboards, storage rooms, forgotten boxes and family collections that have not been opened for years. So, before you throw out that old tape collection, let us work from the more accessible discoveries toward the examples where rarity, condition and history begin to change everything. Number 10. Oversized rental horror tapes. Start with the tapes that look least important. During the rental era, video shops often used large, distinctive cases designed to make films visible on crowded shelves. Horror films were particularly good at attracting attention, so their packaging could be dramatic, colorful, and much larger than the standard VHS case. Today, that oversized packaging is part of the appeal. The reason is simple: rental tapes had difficult lives. They were handled constantly, returned by customers, damaged, replaced, and eventually thrown away. Many disappeared long before anyone thought of them as collectibles. The surviving examples can therefore tell a different story. Collectors may look for large-format horror releases, particularly obscure titles and editions that were produced in relatively small numbers. Ordinary examples may have modest value, while scarcer releases in good condition can command considerably more. And here is the detail people often overlook: a rental sticker does not automatically ruin the tape. In some cases, that old label is actually evidence of the object's history. It tells you that the cassette really belonged to the rental world, rather than simply being a later home copy. So if you find a VHS case that is noticeably larger than the others, do not dismiss it because it looks battered. Look at the artwork, the label, the release information, and the condition. The ugliest box in the cupboard may have the more interesting story. But rental history is only one path to rarity. The next category comes from a much more unusual period in British video history. Number 9. Early pre-certificate releases. There was a period when British home video was operating under rules very different from those that came later. Before the introduction of formal certification requirements, some films appeared on video without the familiar ratings and certification markings that became standard. When regulation changed, those early releases became historically significant. Collectors now pay particular attention to certain pre-certificate editions, especially early horror releases. The important point is that the title alone is not enough. You have to identify the actual release. Look closely at the sleeve and spine. Check the publisher or label, the copyright information, and the presence or absence of certification markings. A famous film released many times over several decades can have one early version that is far more interesting to collectors than the later copies most people remember. This is a perfect example of why age by itself is a poor guide. An old VHS is not automatically valuable. An old VHS with the right release history can be a completely different object. And there is a certain irony here. Some of the films that families once considered embarrassing or questionable are precisely the ones that later developed serious collector interest. The respectable copy on the shelf may be ordinary. The controversial one hidden behind it may be the one worth researching. Number 8. Factory-sealed Disney tapes. Disney VHS tapes are surrounded by more myths than almost any other category. You may have seen enormous prices attached to old black diamond editions online. But an asking price is not the same thing as a completed sale. And an ordinary opened copy should not be mistaken for a five-figure collectible simply because it carries a familiar Disney logo. That distinction matters. Most common opened Disney VHS tapes are not rare treasures. The interesting examples are the ones where something genuinely unusual survives. An early release, a rare variation, a promotional edition, a printing difference, or, most importantly, original factory sealing. A sealed tape is a different proposition because the condition of the object has been preserved as part of its history. Think about what that means. Someone bought that film decades ago and never opened it. The shrink wrap survived. The packaging remained intact. The object effectively stopped moving through time while everything around it changed. That is what collectors are buying, not simply the movie. They are buying a preserved piece of its original commercial life. So if you discover an old Disney tape still wrapped in its original packaging, resist the temptation to open it just to see what is inside. Opening a collectible can permanently change the very condition that makes it interesting. And Disney is only one example of a much broader principle. Sometimes the most valuable thing about a tape is not the film at all. It is the fact that nobody watched it. Number 7. Betamax and other forgotten formats. There is something fascinating about obsolete technology. The formats that lost the battle for the living room can become unusually interesting once the machines disappear. Betamax is the obvious example. It was an important part of the early home video era, but VHS eventually became the dominant format. Once a technology falls out of everyday use, its surviving ecosystem begins to shrink. That creates a peculiar problem for collectors. The tapes are still around, but the equipment required to use them becomes harder to find. Certain Betamax releases, particularly interesting films and early editions, can therefore attract collectors who are looking for objects from that short period in technological history. The same principle applies to other abandoned formats. Laserdisc, for example, is generally not rare simply because it is old. Many ordinary discs have little value. But particular editions, unusual pressings, and complete box sets can be much more interesting. And sometimes the machine itself becomes part of the collectible. A boxed working player can be valuable to someone who owns a collection of tapes but has no reliable way to watch them. This is an important lesson when clearing an old house. Do not automatically throw away the obsolete equipment just because you no longer have a use for it. The machine that looks completely useless to one person may be the missing piece of another collector's collection. But there is an even rarer type of VHS that was never really intended to become a commercial product in the first place. Number 6. Promotional and screener tapes. Some VHS tapes were never meant to sit on a shop shelf waiting for a customer. They were made for people inside the industry. Film distributors sent preview cassettes to video stores. Promotional copies were used to introduce upcoming releases. Screeners could be distributed for review or consideration. Some tapes were prepared for retailers, staff, or other industry purposes. The labels can be surprisingly direct. Words such as promotional, screener, preview, or not for resale can immediately tell you that you are looking at something different from an ordinary retail copy. And because these tapes were created for a limited purpose, their survival can be much more interesting than that of a mass-market release. Imagine a film that millions of people eventually watched. Now imagine a much smaller number of early promotional cassettes being sent out before the public release. That early version becomes a piece of the film's commercial history. For collectors of a particular movie, director, or genre, that distinction can matter enormously. The best places to look are not necessarily old video collections. Think about the people who once worked around films: video shop employees, cinema workers, reviewers, broadcasters, and others connected to entertainment businesses. A promotional tape can look almost ordinary until you read the label, and that is the recurring pattern in this entire subject. The valuable clue is often sitting in plain sight. Number 5. Withdrawn, recalled, and banned releases. A product normally becomes less common because people lose interest in it. A VHS tape can become rare for a completely different reason. It can disappear because someone decided it should no longer be sold. A film might be withdrawn. A release could be recalled. A particular version might be censored or replaced. A music title could disappear after a dispute. A documentary might be removed following complaints. Whatever the reason, the result can be the same. The copies that escaped into the world before the withdrawal become survivors. That does not mean every withdrawn title is valuable. The story has to be documented, and collectors still care about condition and the exact edition. But this category is fascinating because the scarcity has a historical explanation. You are not simply looking at an old cassette. You are looking at an object that represents a particular moment when something changed. The best way to investigate one is surprisingly simple. If you remember that a particular film caused controversy, search for the title together with terms such as withdrawn, recalled, banned, or original release. Then compare the details of your tape with reliable records. Do not rely on the title alone. Two tapes carrying the same film can represent completely different editions, and sometimes the difference is exactly what collectors are looking for. Number 4. Home-recorded footage with historical value. Now we move away from commercial films entirely. This category is important because it reminds us that value does not always begin with something a company manufactured. Sometimes it begins with something an ordinary person recorded. Family camcorder tapes may contain birthdays, holidays, and ordinary gatherings. Financially, those recordings may have little commercial value. Emotionally, they can be priceless. But there is another possibility. Look at the background. A family recording made decades ago may accidentally capture a street that no longer exists, a building before demolition, an old factory, a market, a local event, or a landscape that has completely changed. Suddenly, the person in front of the camera is no longer the only interesting part of the recording. The world behind them becomes historical evidence. Archives, researchers, documentary producers, and local organizations can sometimes have an interest in footage that records places or events that have disappeared. This is why old home recordings should be treated carefully. Magnetic tape does not remain perfectly preserved forever. If you have irreplaceable family footage, transferring it to a modern digital format is far more important than wondering whether it might someday have a monetary value. Because there is one thing that cannot be recreated, a moment that has already disappeared. You can reproduce a commercial VHS release. You cannot recreate the exact street your town looked like 40 years ago. And that makes this category valuable in a completely different way. Number 3. The games that were left behind. If your old VHS collection shares storage space with childhood video games, stop before you clear the entire box. The early generations of home gaming created their own collector market, and condition plays an enormous role. A loose cartridge is one thing. A complete game with its original box, manual, inserts, and accessories is something else. Packaging matters because most people treated it as disposable. Boxes were thrown away, manuals disappeared, inserts went into drawers and were eventually lost. Consoles were stored without their original packaging. That is exactly why complete examples can become difficult to find. The famous record prices attached to sealed games can be misleading if you assume every old cartridge is worth a fortune. Most are not. But a well-preserved, complete and desirable title can be substantially more interesting than the loose version. This is where an old storage room can become surprisingly useful. You may find the game in one box and its original packaging flattened somewhere else. The pieces that looked worthless separately can become much more meaningful when reunited. It is a small lesson in collecting, but an important one. Never assume the packaging is rubbish simply because the object itself is the thing you remember buying. Sometimes the box is the rarest part. And if that principle sounds familiar, the next category takes it back to the films themselves. Number 2, first release copies of famous films. Famous movies are not automatically rare. That distinction becomes critical when you are examining titles such as Star Wars, Jaws, E.T., or Back to the Future. These films were released again and again. Different labels appeared, packaging changed, new editions replaced old ones, branding evolved. Later versions became the copies most people remember. Collectors, however, may be interested in the earliest releases. It is similar to the difference between an ordinary later printing of a famous book and an early edition. The title may be identical, but the physical object represents a different moment in history. So take the familiar films out of the box and inspect them carefully. Look at the label. Look at the copyright information. Look at the distributor or branding. Then compare the exact version against documented release information. The objective is not to find an old copy of a famous film. It is to determine whether you have an early version that belongs to a much smaller group. Condition matters too. A sealed early copy can occupy an entirely different part of the market from an opened rental cassette covered in stickers. That is why a box full of familiar films should not be judged at a glance. The title tells you what is on the tape. The edition tells you what the object actually is. And that brings us to the final category, where all of these principles come together. Number 1, the factory-sealed VHS. The most important detail to look for may be the simplest one. Is the tape still sealed? Original shrink wrap can completely change how collectors view an otherwise ordinary commercial VHS. The film might have been produced in enormous numbers, but an unopened copy represents something much rarer, a copy that survived decades without being opened. And occasionally, there is another layer: provenance. One remarkable auction example involved a factory-sealed copy of Back to the Future from 1986. The tape had never been opened, and it reportedly had a connection to actor Tom Wilson, who played Biff in the film. The copy sold for $75,000. The important lesson is not that every sealed Back to the Future tape is worth anything close to that amount. It is not. The sale was exceptional because several factors came together: the condition, the age, the film, and the story of ownership. That is how collectible markets work. The object itself may be familiar. The surviving example is what becomes unusual. A sealed tape is effectively a time capsule. The packaging preserves the appearance of a commercial product from another era, untouched by decades of handling. And this is why opening one can be such a serious mistake. If the original seal is part of the collectible condition, removing it destroys something that cannot simply be put back. You may satisfy your curiosity for a few seconds, but you cannot restore an original factory seal once it has been broken. So if you discover a VHS that is still wrapped, do not open it simply to inspect the cassette. Leave it exactly as you found it. Document what you can without disturbing the packaging, and if it appears genuinely unusual, seek an appropriate specialist opinion. What these tapes really teach us. After looking at all 10 categories, there is a pattern that becomes difficult to ignore. The value is rarely hiding in the word VHS. It is hiding in the details. A rental case can matter because the original packaging survived. A pre-certificate release can matter because it belongs to an early chapter of video history. A Disney tape can matter because it remains sealed or represents an unusual edition. A Betamax release can matter because the format itself disappeared. A promotional cassette can matter because it was never intended for ordinary retail sale. A withdrawn title can matter because its history explains why surviving copies are scarce. A home recording can matter because it captured a world that no longer exists. A game can matter because its packaging survived when almost everything else was discarded. A first-release film can matter because it represents an earlier version of something everyone recognizes. And the sealed tape brings all of those principles together. Scarcity, condition, history, provenance. That is the real lesson. An old object does not become valuable merely because it survived. It becomes interesting when you can explain why it survived, what makes that particular example different, and why collectors care about that difference. So before the next clear-out, take another look at that forgotten box. Do not assume the oldest-looking tape is the best one. Do not assume the most famous film is the rarest. And do not believe an extraordinary online asking price without checking what comparable examples have actually sold for. Start with the simple clues, the packaging, the label, the release information, the condition, and above all, whether the original seal is still intact. Because sometimes the object everyone has stopped noticing is the one that deserves a second look. And if you have a box of old tapes waiting somewhere in your house, perhaps the most interesting question is not what they are worth. It is what story they have been carrying all these years.